I'm Emma Carter, and if you asked my family about me, they'd probably just call me the quiet one. Honestly, they probably wouldn't say much at all because in their eyes, I was never the chosen one. That title always belonged to my older sister, Madison. We grew up in a quiet suburb outside Portland, Oregon, white picket fence, neatly trimmed grass, and a wind chime that tinkled softly by the door. My father, Douglas Carter, was an aerospace engineer, disciplined, precise, always lost in blueprints. My stepmother, Lisa, came into the picture when I was 2 after my birth mom died in a car crash. Lisa took on the role of mother quickly, but she never saw me as fully hers. Madison was her daughter from a previous marriage, 10 years older, beautiful, brilliant, magnetic. She was the debate team captain valedictorian and the one always mentioned in local newspapers. Family photo albums were practically shrines to her. If I showed up in any pictures, I was usually in the corner, blurry, offering a hesitant smile. Anytime I got a B+, Lisa would sigh and say, "Emma, if you just applied yourself, you could be more like Madison." My dad would nod absently, his eyes still glued to whatever technical sketch he'd brought home from work. Dinner conversations were showcases of Madison's latest wins, a summer internship at Portland's top event firm, a private meeting with the mayor. Me, I just quietly passed the salad, learning to fade into the background. But that didn't mean I was empty. I loved math. I was obsessed with logic, puzzles, encryption, things that clicked into place. Once I won first place at a regional model rocket competition, I raced home gripping the certificate like a trophy. Lisa glanced at it, said, "Oh, that's nice." Emma then turned to Madison to ask about her internship in New York. That day I understood something clearly: I couldn't win their game. If I wanted space to grow, I'd have to carve it out somewhere they couldn't control, somewhere they wouldn't see coming. I still remember the exact night I told my family I was joining the military. I had just turned 18, freshly graduated from high school. That evening, we were all at the dinner table, a rare full gathering. My dad, my stepmom Lisa, my sister Madison, and her fiancé Blake, who owned a booming construction business. I'd prepared myself. I didn't expect applause or warm hugs. But I didn't expect them to laugh in my face either. When I said I'd applied and been accepted into basic training, the table went quiet for a beat. Then Madison burst out laughing. She leaned toward Blake and said, like I'd announced I was joining the circus, "Emma, in the military, she's going to be marching and shouting orders all day." Blake tried to be more diplomatic. "Well, I mean, the military works for some people. But if you've got potential, why not aim higher?" Lisa just sighed, her fingernail tapping the rim of her wine glass. "Emma, the military is for people who don't have any better options. You're not Madison, but you could still do something respectable." My dad said nothing. He just set his fork down mid-chew and looked at me like I'd somehow disgraced the Carter name. I sat there in the same kitchen where I'd done algebra homework and made morning coffee for Dad and realized I had just stepped outside the box they'd built for me. But the truth was, I'd never felt more certain about anything. I wanted challenge. I wanted to be judged not by grades or charm, but by grit, intelligence, and resilience. That night, lying on my bed, I stared at the ceiling and made myself a promise I wouldn't come back in shame. They thought I'd fail. They thought I wasn't strong enough. They thought I joined the military because I had no other path. I was going to prove them wrong. From that moment on, I wasn't Emma, the shadow of Madison. I was recruit Emma Carter, ready to walk into a world they would never understand. I used to think I was strong until I arrived at basic training. Every day started at 5 a.m., with a shrill whistle and endless runs that made my legs feel like jelly. They yelled in our faces. They pushed us to our physical and mental limits. Some nights I lay in my bunk, every muscle aching, staring at the ceiling through the noise of a dozen snoring women, and asked myself, did I make a mistake? I wasn't the fastest. I wasn't the strongest. I didn't stand out in any obvious way, but I had one thing I didn't quit. Every time I felt like giving up, I heard Madison's laugh in my head, Lisa's dismissive tone, my dad's silent disappointment. They didn't believe I could do anything meaningful. That was reason enough to keep going. When we moved into specialized training, I was selected for intelligence analysis, partly because of my quick thinking and logic skills. We ran simulations, decoded signals, tracked patterns in massive data sets. I wasn't taught to fight with fists. I was trained to see what others missed. One instructor told me, "Carter, you see what others overlook. That's what we need." For the first time, I felt like I had value. Not because I was in the spotlight, not because someone clapped for me, but because I knew exactly what I was doing and it mattered. Meanwhile, Madison was gracing lifestyle magazines for million-dollar weddings she planned. But I was learning how to read complex signals from satellite feeds. I didn't need to be center stage at some glamorous event. I was doing work few people understood, but that could save lives. I started to believe in myself. Not in the loud, boastful way, but with a quiet, solid certainty, the kind of strength that doesn't need anyone else's validation. I was never the star in my family's eyes, but for the first time, I didn't need to be, because I knew I was already shining. Within 3 years, I completed multiple advanced trainings and was transferred to a special unit in military intelligence. My job was to analyze signals, decrypt information, and help plan high-risk operations. Nothing I did ever made the news, but I knew we saved lives. Sometimes hundreds, just by delivering the right analysis at the right time. After an 8-month deployment overseas, I was promoted to captain. We had dismantled a terrorist communication network and prevented a major attack on an Allied base. I received formal commendation from our commanding officer. But the first thing I did after returning home, buy a bottle of wine and get ready to attend Madison's wedding. I showed up in my dress uniform not to show off, but because I came straight from the base. Lisa looked me over and sighed. "Emma, it's not Halloween." Madison gave a little smile and added, "That's cute." "You're still in your military phase, huh, Mom? We really need to help Emma get a real job someday." That's how they saw me, a little sister still figuring it out, while Madison stood in the center of the room in her designer gown, surrounded by elite guests. Lisa bragged that Madison had landed the cover of Northwest Living. Meanwhile, I stood by the buffet table holding a glass of water and swallowing the silence. I had just helped prevent a disaster that could have wiped out an entire unit. But that didn't matter, not to them. Not if I didn't own a mansion or throw $1 million wedding or have my photo framed in the living room. In their world, value had to be visible. It had to sparkle. Me, I worked in shadows. And maybe that's why they never truly saw me for who I was. I've been in dangerous zones, places where one wrong move could mean life or death. But few things have made me as tense as packing for my parents' 35th anniversary party. No field manual had prepared me for stepping into Madison's mansion, my sister, who never missed a chance to make me feel small. I had just come off a 10-month classified deployment, one of the most critical operations I'd ever been part of. While I couldn't share the details, I knew lives had been saved because of my team's work. But my family didn't know. And frankly, they'd never asked. I chose a simple sweater and slacks. I could have worn my uniform, and if Sarah, my closest friend in the unit, had been there, she would have said, "Wear it. Let them see you." But I was tired of having to prove myself. I just wanted to get through the evening without swallowing another wave of quiet rage. Driving into the suburbs where Madison lived felt like watching a highlight reel of every jab and dismissal I'd endured. Her cutting remarks, Dad's blank stares, Lisa's endless favoritism. I didn't know what I was hoping for, a compliment, a sliver of recognition, or just to be seen. When I arrived, her house looked like a set from a luxury home magazine. String lights, glowing a manicured lawn trimmed to architectural precision. Luxury cars lined the driveway. I had to wedge my beat-up rental between a polished BMW and a gleaming Audi. I stepped out clutching a bottle of wine and an overnight bag, hoping to blend in like some random guest. But deep down, I knew tonight wasn't going to be like the others, and I had no idea that in just a few hours that perfect house would fall into stunned silence, confronted by a truth none of them saw coming. The moment I stepped into Madison's mansion, I knew I'd walked onto her stage. The air smelled like designer candles and expensive wine. Laughter and clinking glasses echoed across the hardwood floors. I forced a polite smile, weaving through the well-dressed guests, mostly Madison and Blake's elite circle. Lisa was the first to greet me. She looked me over and tilted her head with that rehearsed smile. "Emma, you look healthy?" she said, her tone just sharp enough to land the weight of the word. My dad shook Blake's hand, then turned to me, tossing out a lazy, "Oh, you're back." "How's the army?" Before I could answer, he was already asking Madison about her latest event contract. I was seated at the far end of the dining table next to Uncle Dean and Aunt Valerie, relatives who barely remembered my name. Throughout dinner, all praise and toasts were aimed at Madison, her $1 million gala, her meeting with a senator, and of course, little Emma, her 9-year-old daughter, getting into a gifted program. When I tried to chime in, gently mentioning I'd just been promoted, Madison cut in with a breezy laugh. "Emma. Oh, she does some kind of paperwork for the military. Logistics or admin stuff, right?" The table chuckled. I smiled, but my hand tightened around my fork metal, pressing into my palm. I didn't respond, didn't correct her, didn't defend myself. I just nodded and kept cutting into my duck piece by piece, as if that were the only thing keeping me steady. "I'm a soldier. I've faced real threats, made life and death decisions. But here in my own family's home, I felt smaller than I ever did in combat zones. Their dismissal didn't hurt the way it used to, but it still sliced like a dull knife. Not enough to break me, but enough to remind me it was never safe to let my guard down. I thought I could make it through. Just a few more hours, and I'd be back on base where no one calls my work just typing. But that moment, that final cut from Madison, it was the last needle in a balloon stretched too tight for too long. Dinner was winding down. Madison stood glass-raised, smiling like a spotlight had just hit her. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate Mom and Dad's 35th, she began, voice warm and performative. "It's been an amazing year. My firm landed a gala for a major tech CEO, Blake's breaking ground on a new resort, and little Emma's been accepted into the gifted program." I swallowed a sip of wine as I realized I'd been reduced to a footnote. No one had asked about me. No one mentioned the promotion, the mission, or the 10 months I'd spent overseas. The room revolved around Madison's version of success, and in it I was barely a shadow. Uncle Dean leaned toward me with a chuckle. "Still doing that army thing, huh? Shot any bad guys lately?" I smiled thinly. "Mostly analysis and strategic ops these days." But Madison swooped in, laughing. "Basically paperwork for generals," she said with a shrug. "Still important, I guess. Logistics matter too, right?" A few guests laughed politely. I set my glass down. My face burned. I opened my mouth to speak, to stand up, to explain that I'd led a team that had prevented a major crisis. But then I remembered most of what I do is still classified, and even if I could talk, they wouldn't really listen. So I stayed silent. One more time, and then the doorbell rang, loud, sharp, intentional. No one had been expecting anyone else. Madison frowned. Blake stood to check. I didn't know why, but in my gut I felt it. Something was about to change. I didn't know what was waiting on the other side of that door, but the air in the dining room changed after the doorbell rang, like the entire house was holding its breath. Madison glanced around, brows furrowed. "We're not expecting anyone." Blake adjusted his tie and slipped into the hallway without a word. I was mid-bite when I felt it something serious. The shift was palpable. Moments later, Blake returned, no trace of his usual grin. He leaned in and whispered something to Madison. Her eyes flicked toward me, then she gestured stiffly. "Someone's asking for you." Before I could process that, a figure stepped into the dining room, poised crisp and in full pilot uniform, looking like he belonged on the cover of a recruitment poster. Daniel, Madison's son, 24, now a commissioned Air Force officer. The room fell into a stunned silence as Daniel stood tall, his cap tucked under his arm, eyes fixed directly on me. And then with absolute precision, he snapped into a formal salute. "Captain Emma Carter, United States Strategic Intelligence Command." He said, his voice clear and unwavering. "Apologies for the interruption, but you're requested for an urgent briefing. Colonel Ramsey asked me to deliver the message personally." The silence grew heavier. Madison's wine glass froze midair. Lisa's eyes widened. My father dropped his fork onto his plate with a sharp clatter. No one moved. I rose instinctively and returned the salute steady, even though my heart was pounding. "Lieutenant Evans," I replied. "I'll join you in a few minutes." But Daniel wasn't done. He turned to the room and spoke, each word deliberate. "Captain Carter is the analyst who saved my entire flight crew. Her intel during Operation Cascade Shield prevented a disaster." Madison's smile had vanished. The table was frozen in shock. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a shadow. I was the light they'd pretended not to see. And Daniel was the one who tore the curtain down. I closed the door behind me, leaving the stunned silence of the dining room behind. Daniel stood in the hallway, his cap now tucked under one arm, his face softer than the sharp salute he'd entered with. He gave me a faint smile, mischievous even. "Sorry for the drama, Aunt Emma," he said quietly, more casual now. "Sarah called me, said they were, quote, tearing you apart in there." I stared at him, part stunned, part amused. Sarah Mitchell. I should have known she was behind this. Daniel didn't deny it. He nodded. She said exact words, "If they call her a glorified secretary one more time, I'm bringing the whole unit to the damn dinner." I figured this was a lighter approach. I laughed. Really laughed for the first time that evening. The tension seemed to fall from my shoulders like an old cloak. And the urgent briefing, was that real? Half and half, Daniel replied, only half smiling. "Colonel Ramsey does need your analysis reviewed tomorrow morning, but I might have exaggerated the urgency a little." He paused, then added, more serious now, "But I don't regret it. You deserve to be seen." I stood still for a moment, absorbing that. The mocking, the interruptions, the condescension, it had all felt like an endless weight. But with one perfectly timed gesture, Daniel had sliced through it. Not because I needed a hero, but because someone in this family had finally understood. "Thank you, Daniel," I said softly, "not just for the salute. For standing up." He nodded, his voice warmer. "You saved my crew's lives. Least I could do was save you from dinner." I chuckled, stepping forward to shake his hand, not like an aunt, but like a fellow officer. And for the first time in years, I felt something lift. Not just recognition, but the deep knowing I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The next morning, I was at my desk on base, deep into a threat analysis report, when my assistant knocked on the door. "Captain Carter," she said. "There's a civilian at the gate. Says she's your sister. Madison Blake." I looked up stunned. Madison here. It was 11 a.m. on a weekday. She should have been at her office reviewing floral arrangements for some billionaire's wedding or closing another corporate sponsorship deal. Did she say why I asked my voice sharper than I intended? My assistant shook her head. Just said it was urgent. I stood, smoothed my uniform, and walked toward the visitor center. Passing through the checkpoints, my mind raced. Was this some kind of PR gesture, a face-saving apology, or just residual guilt after being publicly embarrassed? But when I walked into the sterile visitor lounge and saw Madison sitting in a designer coat, fingers clenched around her handbag, eyes wide and unsteady, I knew this wasn't for show. Captain Carter, she started, tripping over the words. I raised an eyebrow. Emma is fine. She took a deep breath. I took the day off. Drove 3 hours to get here. I didn't know if they'd let me in, but I had to talk to you. I stood still, arms folded. About last night. She nodded. And all the years before that? For the first time, Madison wasn't the polished perfectionist, the center of attention. She looked at me like she was finally seeing more than her reflection. I've been wrong, she said. Petty, arrogant. I needed you to be small so I could keep feeling big. I didn't say a word. Her honesty landed hard, but it was real. You don't have to forgive me now, she continued. But I want to understand. Could we maybe have lunch sometime if you're willing? I'd like to know what you actually do, what you can share. I hesitated. A part of me wanted to slam the door, but the part Daniel touched last night, the one that hadn't given up on family entirely, loosened just slightly. Not today, I said, but maybe someday. And for the first time in our lives, Madison nodded without argument. After the night Daniel walked in and turned the entire room upside down with one salute, my phone stopped being silent. For the first time in months, my dad called. His voice wasn't its usual confident tone, the one he used with Madison. It was cautious. Your mom? Lisa. She's been telling her book club you're a hero. I almost laughed. Hero is the last word that comes to mind when I'm writing threat reports or decoding encrypted signals. But I just replied quietly, I'm just doing my job. He paused, then added, I didn't realize your job was that important. Then came the real reason for the call. When are you coming to visit? I glanced at the monitors on my desk, satellite maps, blinking data patterns updating. I've got a full schedule, I said calmly. I'll let you know. The words were simple, but something inside me had shifted. I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I wasn't craving their understanding. They were reaching out, but not because something inside them had changed. It was because Daniel forced them to finally look. Madison texted a few times too, inviting me to dinner. Just us, she wrote. No guests, just family. I didn't reply. Not at first. One time I typed and deleted a response 4 times before locking my phone. I wasn't angry, not anymore. I was just tired. Tired of having spent years trying to be seen, and now I didn't need it. I realized I no longer belonged at a table where the toasts always went to one person. I wasn't meant to be in family photos where I was just the blurry one in the background. I had my unit, my command, and a version of myself I'd fought hard to build. That night I sat with Sarah at the bar near base. She raised her glass eyes gleaming. To Captain Carter, who knows her worth and doesn't need a room full of nods to prove it. I smiled and clinked glasses with her. For the first time in years, I didn't need recognition. I just needed truth. And I had it. A week after that unforgettable dinner, a small package arrived at my office. No logo, no fuss. Just a plain box addressed simply to me. The sender, Daniel Evans. I opened it and found a small wooden picture frame. Inside was a photo of Daniel and me at the coffee shop from the week before. We were both out of uniform laughing. I looked at ease, unarmored. A version of myself I rarely saw in the mirror. Folded behind the frame was a handwritten note. Keep being a badass. Aunt Emma. D.E. I laughed out loud, shaking my head. It wasn't poetic. It didn't need to be. In those few words, he said everything I didn't realize I needed to hear. I was enough. I didn't need permission to exist to lead to matter. I placed the frame next to another one that had always been there, me and Sarah Mitchell grinning after a mud-covered training exercise. The 2 people in those frames were the ones who had always seen me clearly, not through the lens of titles, family expectations, or spotlight comparisons. Since that night my family still calls, Madison still texts inviting me to dinner. Dad asks when I'll visit. Lisa? Well, she's suddenly trying to be nicer. I reply politely, but I keep my distance. Not out of bitterness, out of peace. I used to think being seen was the victory. I was wrong. The real win is when you no longer need to be seen because you finally see yourself. And now, in my quiet office with satellite data blinking on the monitors, I go back to work decrypting, analyzing, leading. That little frame sits on my desk, not as a reminder of the past, but as a marker of how far I've come. I am Captain Emma Carter, and I am no one's shadow anymore.